Hello again, and we are now ready to resume our program this evening. I hope you all enjoyed this wonderful dinner. Thanks again to Ethan Davidson. And yes, let's give Ethan a big round of applause. It is my great pleasure right now to introduce to you Steve Wells. Steve Wells is the Executive Director of the Animal Legal Defense Fund. And for those of you who don't know what ALDF is, and I'm sure you all do, but nonetheless I'll tell you, it's the premier nonprofit organization dedicated to using the legal system to protect animals. And under his leadership, the ALDF Attorney Pro Bono Program, which he founded in 1999, has yielded millions of dollars of donated legal hours from attorneys from around the country. The litigation program, which is directed by Carter Dillard, I'm not sure where Carter is, was revitalized, and now it boasts an 8-person legal team with over 25 active matters. The criminal justice program, directed by Scott Heiser, has worked on thousands of cases to bring animal abusers to justice. And just this last year, a brand new legislative affairs program directed by Chris Green was created and has been instrumental already in passing or defeating well over a dozen bills impacting animals at the federal, state, and local levels nationwide. So a lot has happened under Steve's leadership. Prior to joining ALDF in 1999, Steve served as the executive director of the Alaska Wildlife Alliance in Anchorage, where he became known for his work to protect Alaska's wildlife. With ALDF, his mission has expanded to include all animals throughout the United States, and we're very lucky that he has brought his considerable talents and experience to this very important role. And I've known and had the privilege to work with Steve for 15 years. And what I know about him is that he is a tenacious and a tough activist, but he also has an exceptionally kind heart. And I think that is the best possible combination you can have in this field. He's a true champion of animal law education, and he was instrumental in the historic collaboration between ALDF and Lewis and Clark, which resulted in the Center for Animal Law Studies. So without further ado, please welcome Steve Wells.
First of all, I'm not sure why there's a Hummer in McDonald's up on the screen, because I don't drive a Hummer and I don't eat at McDonald's, just FYI. So I turned 50 this year, which is a landmark, obviously. I also realized that Kiron Suckling, who I'll be introducing, turned 50 this year. But it makes you think about all that's changed. You know, you get reflective when you turn 50. How many of you remember when the answering machine was high-tech? And how many of you remember when we switched from the old dial phones and got the push buttons? And then there was party lines, if you remember. Of course, now I carry around a phone, quote-unquote a phone, that's got more power than like NASA computers of 20 years ago. So a lot has changed in 50 years. And the theme of this Animal Law Conference is Animal Law in a Changing Environment. And the last 50 years really were marked by the rise of the environmental movement and the passage of landmark environmental laws that gave rise to, things like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and really landmark environmental legislation. And yet some of our biggest environmental challenges remain: global warming, population growth, shrinking resources, including and perhaps especially clean water. And it's going to take the combined efforts of the animal protection movement and the environmental movement to solve problems of these magnitude. So I want to see us working more together. I think back to, turning 50, I think back to the year I was born, 1964, which was also the year that the Wilderness Act passed. And it was one of my favorite pieces of legislation, partly because I love the outdoors, so having wilderness areas preserved was, I have a self-serving love. But I love the way that the Act defined wilderness. said, "A wilderness in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life exist untrammeled by man." And this was an astonishing law for 1964. I mean, if you think about it, for centuries, human beings had viewed nature as something to be feared and something to be conquered and subdued. And suddenly, we passed a law that said it was nature that needed protection from us. It was a huge shift in consciousness, and I think one of the key moments in the birth of the environmental movement. Over the next years, as I said, the environmental movement was able to pass the Clean Water Act, to push to pass the Clean Air Act, and to even create an agency devoted to environmental protection, the Environmental Protection Agency. And it was a really great time for me growing up. I was excited that there seemed to be this momentum for change that was propelling us to a truly sustainable society that would respect all life on Earth, and that meant a lot to me. And of course, like many people, I was determined to do my part, so I rode my bike more, and I participated in creek cleanups, and recycled, and did all those kinds of things. And when I realized that my diet, that eating animals caused far more environmental harm than eating plants, I became a vegetarian. It was only later that I considered the horrific lives that animals raised for food lived, especially in modern factory farms, that I became a vegan and an animal rights activist. For me, I never saw a conflict between environmental activism and animal rights activism. Both are essential to protecting our planet and reducing suffering. And for example, getting back to the Wilderness Act, we all want to see a wilderness protected, untrammeled by man. And whether it's because we recognize the rights of the animals that exist in those places to have a habitat suitable to their lives, or whether it's because we believe in the ecological benefits of intact ecosystems, it doesn't matter. It's important to all of us. And we can't fight climate change, the single biggest challenge facing us environmentally today, without reducing, if not eliminating, our reliance on animal products. So we can't really address climate change without reducing or eliminating our consumption of animal products. According to the UN, raising animals for food is a greater source of global greenhouse gases than all forms of transportation combined. And those of us in this room obviously know that it's also the source of the greatest amount of animal suffering. So consuming animal products is an environmental issue. And fighting global warming is most definitely an animal rights issue. But as our population swells, so too does the demand to feed growing numbers of people. So we see, for example, in my lifetime alone, this was something that I looked at, was curious about. Our population has more than doubled from 3.2 billion people on the planet when I was born to 7.2 billion people today. That's an alarming rate of growth. Not surprisingly, the number of animals raised for food then has also skyrocketed, and the number of wild animals killed for food has resulted in worldwide collapses in fish and wildlife populations. These aren't easy issues to deal with, or even to talk about, but neither can we ignore them. We need to have uncomfortable conversations about what Al Gore called inconvenient truths. And we need to build bridges between the animal and environmental protection movements if we're going to solve these big picture problems. It's going to be up to all of you in this room to build the bridges between the environmental and animal protection communities to solve these big picture problems. And I have great hopes, seeing this conference and seeing the level of thinking that's going into this, that we will be able to do that. And I encourage you to build those bridges. Thank you. And I just want to say what better place to have a conversation about the connections between the environmental and animal movements than Lewis and Clark Law School. It's ever been known as a top-notch environmental law school, and now it has the premier program in the world for animal law as well. This conference wouldn't be possible without the support of Dean Jennifer Johnson, who you heard from earlier. And we want to give her a round of applause. I don't know if she's still here, but thank you, Dean Johnson, for your support. And I want to say a special thank you, and I'd actually ask that the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter here at Lewis and Clark, if all of you who are members would stand up for a moment. Yay! Thank you so much. It takes an incredible amount of labor to make a conference like this happen, and they're doing it on top of being law students, so they really deserve our appreciation. Great work. And I also want to say thanks to the wonderful team at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark, which is a collaboration between ALDF and Lewis and Clark that we're extremely proud of. Since 2008, we've been doing it. And so Pam Frosch, who's the executive director of the Center for Animal Law Studies, and Kathy Hessler, who's the clinician for the center, and Natasha, who we heard from, who's director of the LLM program. Thank you so much. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce Kiron Suckling, who we were just reminiscing on some environmental battles that I wasn't even aware that we were connected on. But he's been doing this for a long time. As I said, he's also a semi-centenarian. That's what being 50 means, by the way. It sounds extra old. Half a century. But Kiron is the founder and executive director of the Center for Biological Diversity. And he's a frequent guest on cable news shows, radio programs, and he's known as a very fearsome public debater for the environment. He was called by the Earth Island Journal a rhetorical pugilist. So those of you in the front row, keep your guard up. And the Animal Legal Defense Fund has been really proud to join forces with the Center for Biological Diversity in several key coalitions that bring together environmental and animal protection issues. Together, we're challenging, some of you may have attended Camilla Fox's presentation earlier today about wildlife services, and together we're challenging the widespread massacre of wildlife that's being done under the USDA Wildlife Services banner. We also joined forces to successfully sue the California Department of Transportation to protect migratory swallows, and we're looking forward to many other collaborations with CBD. Oh, are we back to the, sorry. I assume that's something Kiron will shed some light on, but I drive like an old Mercedes that runs on recycled fryer oil, just FYI. I don't drive a Hummer. Unlike a lot of mainstream environmental groups, the Center has been really tenacious and has tackled some of the really important problems. For example, its Take Extinction Off Your Plate program has gone directly at the issue of how our diet choices and how a meat-based diet affects the environment. And they've also taken on the very thorny issue of population growth and how that affects the environment. Some of you probably attended the population-oriented program earlier. Just a few weeks ago, Kiron and many thousands of others participated in the New York protest on global warming, which was the largest of its kind in history. And because this is an animal law conference, full disclosure, Kiron and others, including Frostpaw the polar bear, were arrested for in an act of civil disobedience at the protest. So he is one of our most committed environmental activists, and we're grateful to have him join us here tonight. Please help me welcome Kiron Suckling.
Okay, is this working? Great. Okay. Well, thanks for that great introduction. It's great to be here in Portland and at Lewis and Clark. In particular, the Center for many, many years has had a great relationship with Peak and Lewis and Clark Law School. We've done many, many lawsuits with the school and have hired a number of their graduates, including Lorianne Bird here as an attorney in our Endangered Species program. And I've worked with Dan Rolfe quite a bit as well. So it's really great to be here. It's funny, he mentioned that arrest in the Wall Street. They took us off to the cell, and we were in the cell, and I thought, this looks really familiar. I realized I've been here before, and I had been put in that cell when we had done a protest to shut down Wall Street in 1990 at Earth Night, and it made me realize it seems like we weren't entirely successful in 1990 because Wall Street was still there. And there we were back in that cell. So, perhaps 20 years from now, if Wall Street is still there, I can revisit that cell once more. But tonight, I'm going to talk about something else. I took this picture, actually, this morning in Beaverton, and there's just so much wrong with this picture. And, if you ask a lot of environmentalists, what's wrong with this picture, you will get a long, long rant about that Hummer there. Yes, the Hummer. And you can imagine the obscenities you would hear about the Hummer. And the good news is, we have better technology than Hummers today. And there's a fairly simple technological fix to the problems of the Hummer and what it does to our climate. In fact, I myself have used my own technology to fix this. Here we go. So no problem, right? Everything's good. We're driving the Prius. We've reduced our carbon footprint. We should all be happy. Well, of course, you could even take that one step further with advanced technology and really reduce our carbon footprint. This picture actually, I know one of the producers of Portlandia. This is going to be in the next episode of Portlandia, where they actually try to reduce their carbon footprint to zero. And these hipsters get the horse and wagon to go to the McDonald's. But of course, the big problem here, besides Oregon hipsters, is not the vehicle, right? It's not the vehicle. It's the meat. It's McDonald's. And if you're really worried about your carbon footprint, you should realize your choice of what you drive is vastly, vastly inconsequential compared to what you eat. And so when you see folks, driving to the McDonald's in a Prius, you have to think, my God, if you drove in a Hummer to the co-op and bought a carrot, okay, you'd be doing vastly more for this planet than focusing on the Prius. But we tend to focus on the Prius because that's easy. That's a technological fix, right? That doesn't require a change in the way you live your life. It doesn't require a change in society. It just is swapping out the car for the horse and buggy, perhaps. But where we really need to go, if we're going to stop global warming, is going to require much more than a technological fix. It's going to require societal change at a very, very deep level, and particularly how we eat. So I want to look at meat production I'm going to talk about tonight. So if we look at the direct carbon footprint of meat production globally, you see that it produces about 16% of all our greenhouse gas emissions. It's more than the entire transportation sector put together. But also, of the greenhouse gases that are most powerful, nitrous oxide and methane, which are vastly more powerful than carbon. Livestock produce 65% of all human nitrous oxide, 35% of all human-produced methane. It's just a spectacular impact. And then if you move on and think about the indirect effect of meat production, the land that is cleared to grow the crops to feed the cattle, the land that's cleared to put the cattle on, the transportation of the meat, the electricity that's used to pump the water to grow the crops for the meat. The latest estimate is 51% of all greenhouse gas emissions annually is used in meat production. 32.6 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's a good news, bad news story. The bad news is that, well, it's bad news. But the good news is this is something incredibly easy at a certain level and positive to fix, because by giving up meat, we save money, we improve our health, we save land. There's just no downside to it. Also, it's something that we can all do ourselves, like regardless of government action, regardless of policy. Each individual can choose to stop eating meat or to reduce our meat consumption. So it's something we can all take meaningful action on. So the enormity of the problem is it's nice that it's matched with something that can really change very rapidly if we're able to convince enough people to take action. Now, most people, when they think about the methane emission of cows, they've watched Beavis and Butthead, and this is what they think is going on. That's the methane emission. So actually, more of it comes from the breathing. It's less dramatic, but in fact, far more than methane emissions come to breathing of cows. But because of the number of them, it's tremendous. And it's not the only effect of the greenhouse gas emissions. This is a slide showing the total amount of greenhouse gas emitted by agriculture. So that includes livestock and non-livestock growth. And what you see here, if you look at this and understanding agriculture, because you'll see a lot of discussion about agriculture and climate change. And people are talking about better ways to grow carrots. Right? It turns out our agriculture is dominated by meat production. Right? You think of agriculture as the plants, and then there's the meat. No, agriculture is about meat. Most of our crops are grown to produce meat. Most of the impact of agriculture is a meat impact. So you can see here, for example, 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture comes from direct emissions from cattle. That's what enteric fermentation means. It's a nice way to say cow farts and burps. 16% is manure left on the pastures from cars. So that's 56% right there. But then you look at fertilizers. Okay, that's 13%. But most of that fertilizer is being put on crops that are grown to feed cattle, not to feed humans. Manure management, another 7%. And then burning the savannas, 5%. And again, why are they burning the savannas? Most often to go out and put cattle on the land. So if you're interested in the difference between different animals that we grow for food and how they impact greenhouse gas emissions, they actually vary fairly dramatically. So this is beef cattle. They're the very highest impact, and that's primarily because lands that we have to clear and manage for them. And also their large numbers. Dairy cattle are also huge, although they're not on wild lands, but are facilities and farms. And then it drops off very rapidly to buffalo, sheep, pig, and chickens somehow got off the map here. So there is a difference in different species and how they contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And because of this, some people have suggested, switching to sheep or pigs and so forth. And that can have a beneficial effect. I think, though, that, once you realize the problem, it makes a lot more sense just to give up all meat together, rather than to try to shift to one that has a less carbon impact, because especially, as I'll speak later, carbon emissions and global warming are just one of the negative impacts of meat production. And there's lots of other impacts where chicken, sheep, goats have just as much a negative impact. So let's talk about some of those other ecological impacts. We'll start off talking about water, especially. So to put a pound of hamburger in your fridge takes 2,500 gallons of water. If you can imagine that. 12 pounds of grain that went into feeding the cattle. And by the way, that's also cattle from public lands. A lot of times people will think, oh, well, I'm not involved in, or I shouldn't worry about cattle on public lands, free-range cattle, because they're not going to these feedlots where they're in terrible conditions. So the vast majority of all cattle out on the wild, on public lands, before they end up on the plate, go to the feedlots. The public lands cattle exist as a feeder system to get cows to the feedlot. They're not an alternative to the feedlot. They're part of the feedlot system. And then 35 pounds of topsoil lost per pound of beef. So the impact is just spectacular. And it goes way, way beyond what we're doing to the climate. So 25% of all land on the planet today is directly devoted to cattle. That means cattle hoofs today are on 25% of all land on the planet. That's what it's managed for. And that's not even the end of the land effect, because then it turns out that most of the agricultural crops that we grow are not grown to feed humans. Most acres, most crop produce are grown to feed cows. 64% of all crops grown in the U.S. are grown to feed cows, not human beings. And 70% of all grain production are grown. In fact, I will not go on my soy rant tonight, but I will say this. Soy is one of the most evil crops in the world. And when you see all the hippies are all stoked about eating their soy because I'm vegetarian, well, it turns out, right, almost all the soy in the world is grown to feed cows, right? They just have this sort of detritus that's left over that they feed to the hippies, okay? No one is growing soy for hippies. Got to tell you, okay? You're eating cow residue, frankly. And we can talk about the genetic engineering of soy and all the land that is cleared to grow soy. But I won't go on my soy rant tonight. I would be impolite here in Tucson, in Portland. All right. So, what does it look like? Why do we need so much land for all these creatures? So, I put together some numbers that try to calculate the number of animals that exist in the world, and did it by biomass rather than numbers of animals, because it sort of averages them out overall. So elephants, they are 649,351 tons of dry metric weight of mass. That's what elephants are in this world. So it's interesting to sort of put that in perspective and say, okay, how would that compare, for example, to chickens? Anyone have an idea? What do the chickens weigh? More or less? What do they weigh? Here's chickens. 20 million metric tons. Elephants are going extinct. Chickens are not going extinct. At least the domestic chickens are not going extinct. The wild chickens actually are going extinct all over this planet. All right, well, let's see if we can sort of balance this out a little bit, because it's just elephants, right? I mean, we can add in some whales and stuff and maybe balance out a little bit. So here's all wild land vertebrates on the entire planet, okay? This is all the wolves, right? All the wolverines, all the bison, all the elk, all the deer, and they are still half as much as our chickens. And that's just the chickens, which are actually the smallest portion of our total livestock production system. So here's the whole deal. Poultry, pigs, sheep, cattle, 300 million metric tons compared to 10 for wild vertebrates. And this is why species are going extinct on the planet, because these creatures and us, and growing them, have usurped everything the wild animals need to eat. You cannot have 300 million metric tons of livestock on the planet without taking up all the land, all the water, all the nutrients, all the forest, because there's just nowhere for them to go. In fact, the center, before we got into this meat campaign, which started a human population campaign to deal with human overpopulation, because it's such a huge impact on the planet. And it was a few years later that we came and started working on meat issues. And part of the reason is I was just looking at this, I just came to realize that when we talk about human overpopulation, it's not just humans, it's the overpopulation of all our livestock together. And in fact, when you look at how they work together all over the globe, I at least have come to the conclusion, I'm not sure there's really any such thing as a human being. Okay? The thing that's destroying the planet is the humano-bovine complex. That's what's destroying the planet. And everywhere humans have gone, as they moved across this planet, they brought their livestock with them. And everywhere where they've had an environmental impact, it's them and their livestock. And in fact, their livestock are the most pervasive impact on land on the planet. There's not a single thing we do as human beings that affects more acres of the planet than our livestock. And so when we think of human overpopulation, we should think not just about the people, but about this huge number compared to this, because that's the total impact, all of the people and all of their livestock. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of those impacts are. This is the eastern elk, went extinct in 1877. There's no photographs of it that exist. This is a picture by Audubon. And it was wiped out because it was a competitor with cattle, as so many other species have been. And we have seen to this very day, 1877, but to this very day, any species that competes with cattle for grass is killed and driven off the land. And we see that with deer, we see that with so many species. We see it on public lands, we see it on private lands, and it's a major cause of decline of species around the globe. This is the Puoli. Species went actually extinct very recently, went extinct in 2004. It's a Hawaiian songbird. And it went extinct primarily due to pig impacts. We humans arrived in the Hawaiian Islands with our livestock, as we always do, and we introduced them into the forest, as we always do, and they started to destroy the forest, as they always do. And that led to the extinction of the species. And in particular, what happened is the pigs not only destroyed the forest and preventing the reproduction of the trees there, but in rooting, they created habitat for mosquitoes, which were not native to Hawaii. And one of the huge issues in Hawaii now is avian malaria, which is wiping out the bird species. And avian malaria, the mosquitoes can only get up the mountains by following the wallowing of pigs. So why are there pigs in the forest today? We introduced them a long, long time ago. And we know what a huge impact they are, but they're still there. In fact, they're still there despite several court orders requiring that they be removed. The reason they're there is people like to hunt pigs. And rather than save endangered species and save these forests, the state of Hawaii is saying we're instead going to manage to keep pig hunting going, even if it's driving species extinct. And it drove this one extinct in 2004. This is the white rump vulture. Occurs in India, and it's still hanging on. It's hanging on by a thread. And one of the primary causes, in fact, the primary cause driving it extinct, is that it feeds on cattle. And those cattle are just full of antibiotics that we pumped into them because they can't survive without them. We keep them in such unhealthy conditions. And the vultures are poisoned by the antibiotics and die. And I include this slide in here to help just get a sense of like just the myriad ways that livestock production impacts wildlife. It's not just habitat production. It's our livestock are essentially just huge vessels of poisonous antibiotics and steroids. And we introduce them into the wild. And then anything that eats them is going to be poisoned by those, including, of course, ourselves. Oops. So this is the gray wolf. I'm sure everyone is familiar with how many wolves are being killed all across the United States right now in the Great Lakes and the Northern Rockies, here in Oregon even, if they feed on cows. I mean, if you look at all the stories about gray wolves being killed, and every one of them is about one thing: protecting livestock interests, because cows eat wolves, even a tiny amount of wolves, right? The number of cows killed by lightning every year in Oregon, right, is about 100 times more than the number of cows killed by wolves. But yet, we have to go out and kill these wolves, endangered species, because of that. And so anything that eats the same thing that competes with cattle, anything that preys on cattle, anything that might eat a cattle, gets wiped out. And it's enormous, enormous impact. This species here is an Oregon species. This is the yellow-billed cuckoo. It's called the rain crow. Just got listed as an endangered species a few weeks ago. It lives on riparian forests throughout the West, or used to. It's been extirpated from most of its range, including, I don't think there are any in Oregon anymore, and they're mostly in the Southwest now. And the primary reason is livestock grazing. We put livestock into our riparian areas. These are the streamside forests. And the big trees are fine, but they proceed to eat all the little trees as they come up, and so there's no reproduction. And so over time, the big trees get old and they die, and there's no young trees coming up. The forest is gone, and many, many species have become endangered because some have become extinct. And the yellow-billed cuckoo is just the most recent one to put on that list because of that. And then this one, the Monarch, which folks may have heard quite a bit about recently. The Center recently petitioned to list the monarch as an endangered species because of just massive 90% declines in recent years. It's declining primarily due to pesticide spraying. And that pesticide spraying is linked to GMO crops, which are designed to be able to tolerate the pesticide spraying. And what are those crops? And who are those crops going to feed? Well, I'll tell you what, most of those crops are not being grown to feed humans. They're being grown to feed cows. And then we spray those pesticides, and the Monarch is now going extinct. So there's this extraordinary number of pathways through which livestock are impacting the planet, through water, through extinction of species, through climate change, and whether it's predation or preying on polluted species or spraying of pesticides. And the reason for this incredible complex web of interaction is that we are a culture of meat. And it is woven into virtually everything we've done. It's completely woven into the power structure. In fact, there was a famous French philosopher, Jacques Derrida, who predicted about America. He said, well, first, I think they'll elect a black president. Then they'll elect a woman president. But there will never be a vegetarian president of the United States of America. Ever. Because this is a culture of meat. And so he was right on the first count. Let's hope he's right on the second count. And let's pray he's wrong on the final count. So with that, I'll open it up to take questions.
I just want to point out Clinton and Gore, you know, on the heels of what you say about presidents. I mean, we have a former president and vice president who have now gone vegan, so it may not have been during their term, but I think we need to acknowledge that, and I think we're going to get a vegan president before we know it.
Yeah, and regarding Al Gore, I don't know if you folks saw it, it was a great piece where he was on one of the talk shows, and he was going on and on about vegetarianism, and someone asked him about PETA, and like, oh, don't these people go too far? And you can imagine that's just the moment when the politician will flip, you know, and it was great to see him just sort of like do this little dance and be like, well, those people have a point, you know. So yeah, hopefully that will change. I will say this: watch Inconvenient Truths, look for the cow. Oh, it's not in there. It's not in there. In fact, I think that Cowspiracy is showing at this event somewhere. Some room? What room is that?
Liberty, which room? In room number 4. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, definitely check it out because it's running continuously throughout the conference. Yeah,
so check out. It's a great new movie, and what it's about is the documentary maker interviews all these environmental groups, so like what's killing the planet, and of course they very quickly come to say meat, and then he says, so awesome, so you've got this great anti-meat campaign, and they're all like, oh, not exactly. So it's a really good movie to see because it also just gives you a sense not both of just the impact, but also how far we have to go to make this a public dialogue, especially among environmental groups, which should all be endorsing this. So, more questions?
Bill Clinton was recently on the Jon Stewart show. I don't know if anyone saw it. It was just about within the last couple of weeks. And he was talking about his Clinton Foundation and how he's going to all these third world countries and trying to feed people. And he kept referring to, well, if each family just had one milk cow, they could, you know, sustain themselves. And I'm like, first of all, there's no such thing as a milk cow. It's a cow that happens to produce milk that we steal. But besides that, he wasn't focusing on teaching families how to grow food and have grains or vegetables or plant products. So I think Clinton's motivation is far more health-wise than ethic-wise. So I just wanted to make that comment. It was just on Jon Stewart like 2 weeks ago. You could probably Google it.
Someone want to hand the mic down, or what should we do? Or maybe we would just stand up and yell. Otherwise, I'll never get back.
Hi, thank you. I don't eat meat, but I eat fish. Am I destroying the planet?
Sadly, yes. Wish I had good news for you. Well, a couple things about that. So, 40% of all people on the planet get their primary source of protein right now from wild fish. And we are experiencing extraordinary collapse of marine fisheries around the planet. We're seeing virtually every large predator in the ocean in serious decline, and many of the fisheries as well. So we have a huge problem with overfishing. The center actually recently started a campaign to get sushi restaurants in the United States to boycott bluefin tuna because of this. So there are huge problems with eating fish. But I will say this: the U.S. fisheries are actually pretty darn good. I hate to say that, and I'm going to get quoted in court on this because we sue the U.S. fisheries all the time to get better rules, and they can do better. And someone sure as hell better sue them. But it's also true that they're vastly better than what we see internationally, and so fish caught in U.S. waters tend to be a much better situation. However, the vast majority of seafood available in the United States is imported. It's not caught in the United States. And so in relationship to that, the Center's actually initiated a lawsuit recently using a very obscure portion of the Marine Mammal Protection Act that says that any fish imported into the United States can only be allowed if they are caught under a management regime that's substantially similar to our Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is not happening virtually anywhere in the world. So we're starting to, and the agency just ignored this for years. There's no regulations on it. There's no process for reviewing imports. And we've sued them, and we demand as a first step that they establish regulations for reviewing all fish imports. And then meanwhile, we're moving toward probably to get an immediate injunction on shrimp imports that are driving the totoaba extinct in the Gulf of Mexico because it's in a terrible crisis. So fish. The bottom line is, it's a really mixed bag. There are some fish that you can get that aren't a problem. In fact, Alaska has actually a really good salmon management plan compared to the lower states, and by using Alaska salmon, you're actually helping to create a market for that and keep that viable. So they don't go. They don't do hatcheries and farm salmon in Alaska like we do down here, which has screwed everything up. So it's a mixed bag. In fact, it was funny. The center, at one point, we thought of creating a app. You can go to the restaurant and put the fish in there and see if you can eat the fish. And then as we started working it, we realized, well, the answer is just no every time. Why do you need an app? You just need a card that says no. You don't need an app for that.
Hi. Thank you. I think everyone says thank you for everything that you've given us to work with here tonight and discuss. I wanted to get back to your idea about creating this more public dialogue and getting it out there, because I think a lot of us feel in the room that a lot of it is like people will make better choices the more that they're informed. And I had a recent experience that really speaks to this. I'm a New Yorker. I came out of tap dance class across from the Beacon Theater on the Upper West Side. And in flashing lights on the marquee, Neil deGrasse Tyson is going to be here tonight for a Star Talk Live, which is his radio show, and he's riding on the coattails of all this attention he's gotten for the Cosmos series. So I was like, husband's out of town. I have nothing to do. I'm going to go see Neil deGrasse Tyson. So I bought a ticket and went back a few hours later, and the episode was on water. And so he had a panel, and apparently I'd never listened to the show before, but he has a couple comedians who do some, entertaining banter, and then he has some experts. So there was that day Robert Kennedy Jr. for Waterkeeper Alliance. There was a Buddhist monk. And then there was another woman who worked for a nonprofit and has a lot of expertise from a more scientific basis. And at the end, they do Q&A, so you can go up if you're lucky enough to, act quickly, which I did. Then you can be one of the people that actually gets to ask a question. So the approach is, and everybody that's there, I guess you don't really know what the subject is going to be before you go. So, but everybody there is, pretty, conscious about the environment and, interested in the various perspectives that are on stage. And then we're talking about, we keep coming around to agriculture and the impact that it has on water consumption. And, but they're not really, I'm sitting in my seat and I'm not hearing really what I want to hear, which is I want to hear somebody talk about animal agriculture specifically and the difference. So I decide in a very calculated way, I'm going to go ask a question and get them to talk about how much water consumption is used for meat consumption. And so I start asking my question in not the most articulate way because I was a little nervous. And Neil deGrasse Tyson looks at me like, and so your question is. And then the woman jumps up out of her seat and she's like, no, she's right. And she gives the statistic about, 2,000, 2,400 gallons versus 15 gallons for plants and stuff like that. And the interesting piece for me about this was that the audience at first was going to, when I said animal agriculture, they were almost like you could see detachment in some of their eyes. But then the minute that the woman jumped up and got that attention, but Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is this well-known, well-respected, very well-educated person, actually surprise on his face about that statistic. And it took the conversation in a very interesting place. And I thought, it's great for the public, but it's also just have somebody who has this kind of attention and this kind of renown be surprised. And then the woman actually, the panelist was like, eat less meat, shouts it out in the beacon, and then everybody starts applauding, which was great. I couldn't have asked for a better end response. But when we're talking about, this was a panel of experts, and I listened to them for an hour. And we didn't hear anything about distinguishing between agriculture and animal agriculture. How can we here better introduce that? And, the Clean Water Act has so much more teeth than the Clean Air Act, too, in terms of, where we're going to get at animal welfare. How can we do our part to actually make that it's such an important part of the conversation, and this is just an example of it's not there a lot of times when it should be.
That's really true, and I think one thing we need to do is bring it up all the time, in every forum we can, because you do hear over and over again at all kinds of environmental forums discussion about agriculture and discussion about energy and discussion about electricity and discussion about greenhouse gases without getting to the next stage of saying, well, where is that water getting used for? What is the agriculture getting used for? Where are those greenhouse gases getting emitted? And you come back to meat. And part of, I think, the big issue there, certainly with environmental groups, and probably many, many others, is that this fear. There's this fear that when you talk about meat, you're talking about diet. And you're talking about something that's so personal that you're going to really upset people. In fact, the only thing worse than talking about meat is talking about reproduction and population, which is, of course, why the center started a population and a meat program. And so we can just piss off every possible human being. So I think, though, that, we have to get the spokespeople, people that are on TV, the people that are on these panels, to recognize this. It's important, and that's not terribly hard. Because the facts are just so dramatic, right? And you talk to them and you lay it out. There's no one who sort of looks at those facts and goes, "Wow, this is not it." But I think so. More importantly, what's needed is to convince them that you can talk about this. And in fact, it's not going to cause chaos. The world is not going to end if we start to discuss eating less meat, or God forbid, eating no meat, or being a vegan. That in fact, people are, for the most part, adults and can deal with that conversation, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. Because it really needs to be done, and I think that until we can get those leaders and spokespeople, and especially I will say environmental groups, environmentalists, to talk about this. We're not going to change things. But we'll also say we've got to figure out how to do it in a way that's non-threatening. I will say this at the risk of pissing people off. There's often a really kind of shrill, angry tone that comes out from people who are advocating not eating meat, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. And the seriousness of the matter is not the beginning and end, therefore it justifies all tones, all actions. You also have to go from the seriousness of the matter to what can I say and how can I say it that will impact people. And in fact, it's interesting, we started this anti-meat campaign, and so we're one of the few environmental groups that have this at all. And we decided early on we would tell people, okay, stop eating meat, but we'd also say just eat less meat. And that will help, and just kind of edge people in it. And sure enough, as you can imagine, we're immediately attacked by the radical vegans because they're saying eat less meat and don't eat all meat, and it's just instant controversy, And you could see this coming a mile away. And it's